I make this video at the start of every year, but this has been the best year yet. I will not be discussing one book I disliked today. If you're new here and haven't seen one of these videos before, this is how it works. First, I recommend you a bunch of booktubers. Then I read one of the books they recommended in their favourite books of the year video, and I'll review it. And it's unofficial, but we all know whoever has the best book is the winner. Now I'm going to tell you this in advance. This year I'm recommending every book on this video. But what's even more impressive about that is that I've gone a little bit rogue with this, trying stuff well outside of my comfort zone. We have poetry, we have short story collections, stuff I don't normally like, and it's all gold. Then we have classics, non-fiction, books which I usually do enjoy, but I never read because I'm too focused on reading in other areas. And it's so nice to get a chance to indulge those areas and find the odd really good book. I have 23 booktubers to shout out, and to keep things brief, all of these channels are people I subscribe to. All of them are quality. I don't want to repeat myself 23 times. I only watch channels that are informative, silly, or my preference, both. So I'm just going to give you a basic rundown of the type of content they create and books they review, as well as letting you know which book from their best of video I will be recommending in the second half of this video. Caitlin from Bandy's book reads literary fiction, horror, thriller, historical fiction, translated and from all over the world. She is very diverse. Lots of prizes as well as book of the month stuff. She recommends the short story collection Friday Black by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brener. Jess from Stalking Kafka, I'm sure you can guess at least one of her favourite authors from her name. She reads classics, literary fiction and Canadian fiction. Her style is silly, rambly but very informative. She recommends Fall to Your Knees by Anne-Marie MacDonald. Gretchen at Made You Book reads mostly new release literary fiction, but can read the occasional lighter novel too. She makes lots of standalone book reviews which are very detailed and intelligent. She recommends Lojman by Ebru Ojen, translated from Kurdish by Aaron Adjei. Do you all like my panda mug? Katie at Books and Things reads mostly classics and historical fiction. She makes lots of raps and blogs, as well as the occasional discussion video that is really stimulating for the brain. She recommends Linda Tressel by Anthony Trollope. Desmond Z makes these cool, silly, charming videos where he'll get distracted and start singing and then bring you back to the book he's talking about. He's unscripted but with a massive and very easy to like personality. He reads a little bit of everything. Literary, romance, thriller, historical. He doesn't really care about genres as long as the book is good. And he recommends Isaac's Song by Daniel Black. Roz from Scallydandling about the books. To watch one of Roz's videos is to be impressed by her terrific brain. She reads lots of new release literary stuff, lots of classics, a bit of poetry and a bit of translated stuff. Roz recommends Happiness Fall by Angie Kim. Sean breathes books. Sean likes literary fiction that is beautifully written and emotionally connective, or anything written by a woman not adequately praised between the years 1930 and 1959, specifically Barbara Pym. Sean recommends The Deluge by Stephen Markley, which he buddy read with Heidi from My Reading Life. Heidi likes books about nature, plants, environmental science, science in general, politics, history and society. Her taste in fiction includes literary, thriller, horror, historical, romance and translated. It's hard not to find something you have in common with Heidi. She recommends The President and the Frog by Caro de Robertis. Eric Carl Anderson is just a lovable book geek who is all about literary fiction and book prizes, with some queer stuff and some classic stuff added in for a bit of flavour. When I watched his video, I wrote down the book I was going to read, but then he said a queer novel where a woman dresses as a man and becomes a pirate, and I promptly deleted the other book and added Salt Blood by Francisca de Torres to my TBR. The newest booktuber in this video is Kerry from Bookish Adventure and Well-Being. She reads literary fiction, which ranges from very smarty pants book to 1 foot in literary, 1 foot in a completely different genre. And she reads a very healthy dose of lesser known books. books too. I definitely learn a lot from her videos. She recommends The Unbroken Beauty of Rosalind Bone by Alex McCarthy. Andy from Roro Reads combines serious book reviews with serious silliness, reading mostly new or recent release literary fiction or literary fiction adjacent books with a dose of SFF and every now and then something a little bit older, all while having the occasional opinion on book prizes. He recommends Butcher's Crossing by John Williams. Andy's arch nemesis is Ben Reads Good. Yes, Reads is actually his middle name. Ben does the work and the research to make some seriously enlightening videos. He primarily reads new releases and book prize novels, with a splatter of, well, almost anything else. Ben recommends True Grit by Charles Portis. I really become a bit of a green-eyed monster when I watch Ben's videos, and also the next booktuber I'm going to shout out, Kat's Field Notes. Both of these booktubers do so many little things that I wish I just had the eye for details, the talent, or the patience they have. Kat mostly reads literary fiction, often going for that pretty writing, low plot, high setting, high emotion, often feminist vibes sort of books, but that's definitely not all she reads. There's lots of variety, a little bit of indie stuff too, such as her recommendation, It Lasts Forever, and Then It's Over by Anne D. Markin. Angelique from Reads and Rereads reads what I would call current fiction. Some new releases with some stuff that has been around for a handful of years, as well as the occasional or backlist novel from a quality author that is still in the literary zeitgeist. Angelique has the honour of recommending 2 books in this video because she recommended Long Island by Colm Tobin and then said make sure you read Brooklyn first. Seeing as I'd never read Brooklyn, I'm taking her at her word and reading both books. Ebony can read just about anything, literary fiction, poetry, non-fiction, genre fiction, classics, but I would say that she is mostly new or newer released literary fiction with a very generous helping of poetry. She has this nice, cozy, chilled out vibes to her videos. She recommends Annie John by Jamaica Kincaid. Mercedes from Mercy's Book is Musing. Mercedes' taste in books would make her the perfect judge for the Woman's Prize for Fiction, which is my way of saying, sack the current judges and give her the gig. I really like her taste in books. She recommends Swanna in Love by Jennifer Bell. Hannah from Savage Reads is a very underrated but quality, straightforward book reviewer. She reads literary fiction, translated and non-fiction, with a side of speculative fiction. She recommends Address Unknown by Catherine Taylor. Shelley Swearington likes books that I don't enjoy. She could read any genre, but you get a lot of historical fiction, a fair bit of classics, non-fiction, literary fiction, and even some manga on her channel. She definitely will read newer stuff, but she's also focused on reading the backlist too. Shelley and I usually disagree. However, once she said that she thinks we have similar taste in non-fiction. So I'm trusting her on her recommendation of Caste by Isabella Wilkinson. Brian from Bookish is Booktube's political expert. He is very well considered and he reads mostly non-fiction and literary fiction, which is split between new stuff and classics, but then he adds a touch of fun to his reading. I've seen Brian review detective novels, romance, thrillers, science fiction, really anything. Brian recommends The Long Form by Kate Briggs. Sarah from Eyes on Indie. Sarah reads new release books by independent publishers. She is always reviewing books that I have never heard of but instantly want to read. And also, if you are a creator with children, do yourself a favour and check out her best books of the year videos. How she deals with children asking for attention while filming and just makes it fun and entertaining for both her child and the viewer is brilliant. Anyway, she recommends Hot Springs Drive by Lindsay Hunter. Charlie Brooks reads Woman's Prize style books. You know, it could be literary fiction, but it also could be genre fiction, and it's often both. But you know, that big broad range that the Woman's Prize often includes on their long list just about covers Charlie's taste. And there's also a healthy dose of non-fiction in Charlie's reading too. She always recommends books I've not heard of too. This time, Charlie recommends Matrescence by Lucy Jones. Gemma from Gem of Books reads science fiction, fantasy, historical fiction, and literary fiction. But really, Gemma likes horrible, sad, miserable books, which is correct. Perfect. She recommends Tea Amour by Hanne Oskovich, which was translated from Norwegian by Karen Fastrup. Olivia from Olivia Catastrophe reads just about everything. Poetry, non-fiction, literary fiction, classics, science fiction, fantasy, romance, middle grade, young adults, graphic novels. And I'm sorry, Olivia, I'm definitely selling you short by not naming every genre that you like, but time constraints. I don't normally like poetry, but I really enjoy Olivia's recommendations when it comes to emotional literature with dark settings. So I'm trusting her recommendation of Forest of Noise by Mossab Abu Toa. And apologies to any booktubers I didn't include. I actually had a big list of about 20 more booktubers I would have liked to include in this video, but this is going to be a long enough video as it is. Let's get on with the books, and to pick a worse book is not just hard, but it's really harsh as well. Nonetheless, it's Lojman by Ebru Ojen, translated from Kurdish by Aaron Ajay. I do want to reiterate what I said before. I liked every book in this video. We're starting at good and moving towards really good before we finally finish in freaking amazing territory by the end of this video. Lojman is set in the Van region of Turkey, you know, where that big lake is, and it follows a mother and daughter of a family of 4. The father has just left, and this relationship between mother and daughter grows really toxic and horrible. We have a mother who doesn't want to be a mother, who never wanted to be a mother, who neglects her children, who is clearly very depressed, who is longing for the return of her husband. And we have a child who is left to run feral, who is so full of rage for her mother and for her neglect. She is so angry, she randomly murders a duck with her bare hands in this book. She is a child who becomes the primary caregiver to her baby brother and longs for her father to return so she can tattle on her mother. The setting of Van comes across as a wasteland, which is very different to the photos I've seen of it. It looks bloody beautiful. Nonetheless, I think this is the best part of the novel. The sense that the land provides nothing, that it is a hard and harsh environment, and you live not because of it, but simply beside it or despite it. And it is echoed in our mother-daughter relationship of neglect. And this is not the only aspect of plot or characters that are mirrored in the landscape and setting. Setting done brilliantly here. The aspect of this novel I struggled with the most was the characters. They are very extreme characters, which I love, but I didn't fully understand why they were the way they were. I don't think there was quite enough pages to explore this with the details I required to really get into this book. Still, a very solid novel with some very good writing in it. It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over by Anne DeMarkin. This is a literary zombie novel focusing on themes of disconnection from our surroundings and written with a very bleak and dark sense of humour. Zombie novels, like dystopian novels, are usually really talking about our society. Either that or they're crap, but this is not a crap book. In this novel, DeMarkin is looking at the meaninglessness of consumerism, the oddity of love, hunger and numbness, and the danger of going along with the pack. For a lot of this novel, our unnamed protagonist has a dead crow hidden inside her empty chest cavity. A dead crow instead of a beating heart or internal organs. It is an interesting metaphor, and one that I don't think I fully understood. The strange love and attachment she feels for the crow, how she keeps it a secret and takes solace in it, and how she is more attached to this dead crow than her arm, which just falls off at some point, is one of these metaphors that I can read a hell of a lot into, but I'm not sure if I'm reading the same thing into it as anybody else. Not that that matters for literature. If it takes your brain there and sparks an idea or a conversation, it doesn't matter if you're in the minority. It doesn't matter if the author didn't put it in there. It happened. It's just that I have no idea what other people are going to get from this strange novel as well. I read this as a commentary on the futility of consumerism, the numbness our society asks us to live with, the ability to ignore what we actually need, and to concentrate on pointless temporary things that don't actually make us happy. And maybe this is backed up by our narrator forgetting their own name, losing her connection to what makes her human, forcing her to unsuccessfully mimic the those around her. And after all, isn't that what we're all doing in society anyway? This weird tale borders on surreal, and it is a novel where you're not sure what you're reading. Is it literary fiction? Is it science fiction? Is it zombie horror, dystopian? Is it a plotless identity novel? Or is it an exploration of grief? This is a book that I can see appealing to fans of Rachel Cusk, but also it won the Ursula K. Le Guin Prize for Science Fiction. And that makes complete sense to me. So it's got range. Probably not really my kind of book, just a little bit too weird and a little bit too plotless for me, but I still really enjoyed it. And I think if you like either weird novels or plotless explorations of humanities, then this is a very well crafted novel that you may fall in love with. The Long Form by Kate Briggs. This book can't decide if it wants to be a novel or an essay collection, which makes it sound really pretentious, and it probably is a little bit pretentious, but it is also really charming, and Helen, the protagonist, has this vulnerability which helps the readers invest in her and her thoughts, and hence the entire book and the heavy brain food essays never become a plotless didactic lecture. Helen and her baby Rose are awake. Rose feeds. Helen tries to go about her day, which regardless of her preference is dictated by Rose's needs. Then a package arrives, a book, Tom Jones, A History of a Foundling by Henry Fielding. You don't need to have read Tom Jones to appreciate this novel. But if you're currently thinking, isn't Tom Jones a Welsh singer who women who should really know better throw their undergarments at? Then I would recommend skipping this book. I think having some knowledge of the influence and importance of Tom Jones on early literature is helpful, even if you haven't read it. One of the things that is kind of cool is Briggs is writing this book in the same way Henry Fielding wrote Tom Jones. They're both allowing their readers to be distracted into an essay or detailed observation. And yeah, okay, I don't think that's particularly clever, but what is clever is how that interruption of plot or narrative can both apply to the book you're reading, the book that it is discussing, Tom Jones, or Helen's life that is constantly interrupted to attend Rose's needs. Tom Jones was the first novel, or the first modern novel. You could even say that Fielding birthed the novel, just like you can say that Helen birthed Rose. Briggs is really exploring how communication and writing could be mirrored in daily life, the intersection of life and literature. This gives us an orgiastic blending of themes. You might believe she is very clearly discussing intimacy, but soon you realize how time and perception link into what she is saying. Then without shifting topics, she's discussing novel writing. It is a real chimera of a novel. This is both the best and the worst part of this book. It is a novel shamelessly written for a certain type of reader. I confess I haven't seen a lot of discussion on this book, but I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest if this were a love-hate kind of book. This is both intellectual and confusing, plotless and emotional, endearing, yet I really feel like this could have been improved by trimming 100 pages or so. The craft and genius that has gone into this writing is amazing. It is a fantastic piece of literature, and I really appreciate that. But was this book a joy to read? At times, but not always. A good book, but I'm disappointed that it never really clicked into being the amazing read, the kind of read that Brian and other readers clearly had. Swanna in Love by Jennifer Bell. Set in the early 1980s, Swanna is a 14-year-old girl who enters in a relationship with a much older man. The novel is narrated by Swanna, which means as the reader you have to be awake to the balances Jennifer Bell has included in the novel, and there are many, but no 14-year-old girl is going to flat out say that yeah, she's being groomed. And the relationship Swanna has with this older man doesn't begin until almost halfway through the book. And this is where I think the book may be slightly poorly marketed, because there's a good reason that this relationship doesn't start until the middle. The first half of the novel is about Swanna's relationship with her mother, who casually introduces her new boyfriend, Borislaw, to Swanna upon picking her up from summer camp. Swanna is expected to ride in the back of a pickup truck with her little brother, and instead of going home, they go to an artist retreat. Swanna and her brother are expected to sleep in the back of said pickup truck too, under the stars. Swanna's dad was meant to have the children for the holidays, but with the separation from their mother recent, and his new relationship, a relationship that is mirrored in a teen magazine Swanna reads, means that He is all too happy to give the kids to their mum to look after for the rest of the holidays. Swanna is completely neglected, and worse, she's an inconvenience for both her parents. She acts out, first reasonably, or as reasonably as any 14-year-old ever gets, moodily asking to go home and saying she's not happy, or doing crazy things like demanding to be fed. But this escalates into screaming, fighting, and calling the cops. Cops who also find Swanna an inconvenience, by the way. Swanna often feels the need to look after her younger brother because she knows her mother won't, changing his bed when he has an accident. So when Swanna invents the most transparent lie and goes off to Doug's house to spend the night, nobody questions it, other than her 7-year-old brother. 14 is a confusing age. Swanna doesn't know if she's an adult or pretending to be an adult. As if to demonstrate that, when Swanna and Doug start having sex, the writing isn't sensual or creepy. Instead, it's really strategic. Swanna thinks she is manipulating Doug with sex, and to be fair, she kind of is at times. She's very much not enjoying the act, but thinking it through. She's playing with the power, playing with being an adult and the attention that it gets her, which is actually pretty typical of a lot of relationships. Swanna thinks she is the sexy other woman. She thinks Doug will leave his wife for her. She believes him when he says that he doesn't love her and that they don't have sex. She thinks Doug believes her when she says she was 18 and then 17, 16 and finally 15, never dropping to 14. One thing I like that Jennifer Bell does really well is show us how several men react to Swanna and Doug's relationship. Doug's friend come over for a poker night he forgets to cancel and meet Swanna. One man leaves saying he's a family man and doesn't approve, like the victim in all this is Doug's wife, and you just know that he's not going to tell anybody. But another man proceeds to tell Swanna about his nickname and where it comes from, and when asked, 85% of men self-report that they're above average. Not once is Swanna treated like a child by any of the adults, and in a really perverse way, Doug is the best adult towards Swanna in this entire novel. I mean, the guy is a child molester, but he's the only person who treats her as an equal at times. Is it because he's a predator and wants to win her trust? Sure, but the point of this novel is not to call out Doug, it's to demonstrate why Swanna might run towards him. He is her father figure, the only person who wants her around and lets her act like herself. And I've not yet mentioned the example relationship Swanna has to build her relationships on. Her mother and Borislaw, or how men simply mistreat her mother, normalising violence and volatile and bad relationships to a very impressionable adolescent. This book left me more than a little bit uncomfortable. Mentally reading this as an adult, with a lot of distance from the situation, Doug is clearly the villain, but we're getting Swanna's point of view, and her parents are just terrible. But it very much doesn't read like Doug is the villain. I think this book would have benefited from a second point of view to provide a bit of balance, and all I can really do is to compare this to My Dark Vanessa, which is the superior book, which doesn't actually say a lot because that book's amazing. But that book benefits from Vanessa looking back at the relationship at a later point in time. Still, this is a book that's doing so much more than it says on the cover, and it is a very successful novel. And we go from one 14-year-old protagonist to another. True Grit by Charles Portis. This is a western centered around a 14-year-old girl who wants to revenge the murder of her father, a modern classic published in 1968 and one of Donna Tartt's favourite novels. Tartt actually narrates the audiobook for this one. Mattie Ross is a 1870s Wild West Arya Stark. She's resourceful, way too intelligent for her age, and she contains a cold anger. She hires a man to kill her father's killer, but on the proviso that she can come along and see him die. Narrated by Maddie as an older woman looking back on her life, this is primarily an enjoyable read. Forget the literature, themes and analysis. This book is promising and delivering on a really good time. Told in a playful and lyrically accessible prose, I really do challenge you to read this book and not enjoy it. It's great. I'm not saying this book doesn't have themes. Every book does. And I'm not saying that this isn't literature. I'm just saying that this book is primarily written for the purpose of being enjoyable, not to be analysed, although you can do both of those things if you like. And sure, this is a novel doing a lot of safe stuff. Who doesn't love an underdog? Who doesn't love an angry child? Working with a couple of crotchety old men and forming an unlikely friendship. Has anybody ever said the plot was too engaging? Yes, the characters are playing on stereotypes, but they're very well drawn too. And that is what the book is doing. It's doing the things that everybody loves reading about. It's not taking risks, but it's doing everything really well. From one Western to another, both novels set in the 1870s. Butcher's Crossing by John Williams. This is the same John Williams who wrote Stoner, by the way. This is a novel with a fairly obvious theme, the impact of man. It is quite an environmental message for a book written in the 1960s. A certain website I looked up after reading this recommend readers who enjoy this book go on with basically anything Cormac McCarthy ever wrote. But I would say the opposite is more true. If you're a Cormac McCarthy fan, then this is probably a very, very good book for you. But Williams is not hitting you quite as hard in the McCarthys as Cormac does, so I think people who don't enjoy Cormac McCarthy could really like John Williams's work too. This is a simple novel. One man comes to a town, Butcher's Crossing, and joins up with another man on an expedition to hunt buffaloes. At the time, the pelts are worth a small fortune. There's no buffaloes around where they are, but one man thinks he knows where they're hidden. The other has the funds and wants the experience. A third man agrees to join them, and they find a massive herd of buffaloes that are so unfamiliar with men they don't run or protect themselves when they're being shot. The men take part in a killing orgy, losing all sense of time and becoming snowed in a valley for the winter. Returning to Butcher's Cross in the spring, they find the world has changed. John Williams is exploring the idea of who changes, the person or the society. This is a journey of self-discovery for one of the men. What does he learn, and how does the environment he's lived in for the last 12 months shape him? It does kind of bring up this city versus country people sort of argument too, how they're different and why the environment might shape that. Ultimately, I guess this is a novel about the futility and meaninglessness of life. This kind of links the work in with Stoner. I do enjoy a theme that authors come back to in multiple different works, looking at it from different angles, allowing one book to enrich the next. All three men on the expedition could look back on this as meaningless, but through their actions, the buffaloes are forever changed. The environment is different. Maybe you can argue that it was meaningless, but it certainly was not without impact. Fantastic character creation, and while I spent a bit of time discussing Cormac McCarthy and the similarities, I think there's a different American great who you should seek out if you enjoyed this novel. John Steinbeck, and primarily The Grapes of Wrath. Brooklyn and Long Island by Colm Tobin. First off, if you want to read Long Island but you haven't yet read Brooklyn, please do that first. I enjoyed Long Island more of the two novels. I would say it's maybe half to a full star better, but star ratings are a bit meaningless, aren't they? But very much the novel is in the same vein. So don't expect Long Island to change your mind about Brooklyn if you didn't like that book, or vice versa. I would say, having read these books together, I just cannot imagine reading Brooklyn on its own. These are two books in communication with each other. Long Island makes Brooklyn a much, much better novel. It flabbergasts me that there is so much time between these two books. Brooklyn follows Alice Lacey as she goes from an Irish girl to a young New York woman, falling in love with Tony, but then she is forced back to Ireland for a funeral and finds herself in an international love triangle. Will she return to New York to be with Tony, or will she stay in Ireland? Set some 15 to 20 years after Alice makes the choice of whether to stay or return. By the way, if you haven't read the description of Long Island, don't, because it does take some of the tension out of Brooklyn if you haven't yet read that. A man turns up on Alice's door and informs her that her husband has been fiddling with his wife's pipes and he's not raising another man's child. This is the catalyst for Alice to return. If that is to return to Ireland or New York, I'll let you figure that one out by reading Brooklyn. But she ponders the life she might have had if she had have made the other choice. She catches up with old friends who view her very differently now, and she shows her children the part of her life she had before they existed. A lot of men get criticised for not being able to write women. And as an aside to any young male writer out there who wants some advice on the topic, write them as humans and not bouncing sex bodies for your spank bank. That way anything that you get wrong you can just put down to character oddity. I think Tobin can really write women, and what's more, he can write women having sex without reducing them to flailing boobs and unrealistic sexual fantasies and contortions. While initially I did find Alice's choice not to raise her husband's child slightly off, by the end I realised two things. She didn't want the reminder of his infidelity, but also she was no longer in love with him. As much as anything, it was a good excuse to leave. However, she hung by his choice of whether he would raise the baby or not. She ultimately wasn't happy with their relationship, and even more so, their life, and she was hoping that he would choose the opposite. And I really enjoy an author pointing out that I underestimate them by the end of the novel. It's kind of like Tobin keeps little pieces of Alice intentionally hidden from me until it was perfect for the plot. The character work in this novel is simply wonderful, as too is Tobin's work in creating the setting. It's not like the plot, the prose, or the themes are bad or lacking in any way, but if you're a character reader, this is a great duology for you. It's so cool to see Alice evolve over these two novels too. She's kind of like a flower opening up, very hidden, and slowly you get to see more and more of her. And then she evolves as she ages. Alice in Long Island is much more confident than the Alice that was in Brooklyn, but she's still very recognisable, and that is great writing. Linda Tressel by Anthony Trollope. Okay, so Trollope is an author I thought I didn't like, but he is so prolific that writing him off seemed a tad harsh, and Katie said that this wasn't quite what he normally writes. So I thought that this represented an easier way to get into Trollope. I really didn't hold out a lot of hope for this novel, but actually it's really good. Now basically this is a story of Linda who lives with her auntie. Linda actually owns a house, but she is expected to be a bit subordinate to her elders. They take in a lodger, Peter, who Linda initially thinks would be a good husband for her auntie, being that he's of her age. Anyway, Peter proposes marriage to Linda and she says no. Then Peter goes to the auntie, who thinks he's a great match for Linda and tries to coerce her into saying yes. Linda still says no. Peter explains to Linda why he would be a good husband, because mansplaining at somebody is a great way to turn their no into a yes. Then there is a young man called Ludwig who Linda is actually interested in, and who in return also likes Linda. And this should be a simple match-up and marriage, but Linda is torn between her heart and her auntie's expectations and not wanting to defy her elders. This is your typical Victorian melodrama, and except that Ludwig actually seems to be a decent suitor, I would say that this was straight out of the Thomas Hardy toxic man love triangle pursuit sort of books. I found it really ironically funny how Linda would do something like say she was interested in Ludwig, and her auntie would say, "I'm not sure Peter could ever forgive that." You know, the whole time she must be thinking, "Good, I hope he fucks off and all." But, you know, in polite Victorian words. Trollope is really exploring the choices and power young women had in the 1860s. This is a woman who owns the house she was living in, being controlled and dictated to by her two lodgers. It is uncomfortable and anger-inducing. I just wanted to reach in this book and slap Peter and Auntie Charlotte. This is quality Victorian literature written by one of the literary greats, and it has made me realise that since I last read Trollope, my taste in reading has probably drifted more towards the style of literature he writes. And because he has written so much, I can take the liberty of being very selective with which novel of his I read next. Also, it's just nice to have an excuse to pick up a classic again. I would like to read more classics than I do. I love classics, but organising my reading and doing all the things I want to do is just too hard, and I just end up reading new releases because they need to be read now. Forest of Noise by Moshe Abu Toa. Poetry is very much not often my thing, which is a weird thing to say because who doesn't love beautiful writing designed to create vivid images or complex and big emotions? Anyway, I trust Olivia's opinion when it comes to emotional literature. We usually agree on that. So it makes sense to me that if anybody was to recommend a poetry collection I could love, it would be Olivia. And that theory proved to be correct. This is a really worthwhile collection to read, not just because it was a great and powerful collection about life in Gaza and the realities of the daily oppressions Palestinians live under. This collection was really connected, both in place and in protagonist. You could read it as a story. It wouldn't have had a plot, but in the same way interconnected short stories add upon each other to create a full vision. These poems added up to something well more than the sum of its parts. And that wasn't something I had been previously getting in the poetry I had read before, which makes me realise what I really need in poetry is a sense of a character or characters that I can build the experiences being described upon. I mean, this is what I really like in the novels that I read, so it probably shouldn't have been a big shock to me that that's what I also want in the poetry I'm reading. This is not a poem. This is a grave, not beneath the soil of homelands, but above a flat, light, white rag of paper. It's very emotional writing, as you can see, but when you place that next to another poem, my grandfather died, Jaffa is occupied, and oranges no longer grow in his weeping grove. Sir, we are not welcome anymore. Our cemeteries don't mind our bodies. We no longer look for Palestine. Our time is spent dying. Soon Palestine will search for us, for our whispers, for our footsteps, our fading pictures fallen off blown up walls. Or next to this one, turn off the lights in every room. Sit in the inner hallway of the house, away from the window. Stay away from the stove. Stop thinking about making black tea. Have a bottle of water nearby, big enough to cool down. Children's fears. Get a children's kindergarten backpack and stuff, tiny toys or whatever amount of money there is, and the ID cards, and photos of late grandparents, aunties or uncles, and the grandparents' wedding invitations that have been kept for a long time. And if you're a farmer, you should put some strawberry seeds in one pocket and some soil from the balcony flower pot in the other, and hold on tight to whatever number there was on the cake from the last birthday. This is not a poem. This is a grave. Not beneath the soil of homeland, but above a flat, light white rag of paper. Doesn't it have so much more power next to those three poems? Imagine what the entire collection does. Big emotional reads. Annie John by Jamaica Kincaid. As a general rule, whenever you get the excuse to read anything Jamaica Kincaid wrote, you take that chance. She's an evocative, talented author. This is a short coming of age story of Annie about the friendships she makes. Often those friendships appear to be more than friendships, but this never fully steps into a full-on sapphic romance. Actually, it's quite a long way off. What Kincaid is looking at is society's pressure, conditions and influences on children. A different example could be how Annie is taught history at school. But it is not the history of the Caribbean island that she lives on, but the history of England and the United States. It is not that this book is exploring any one of these topics per se, although there are plenty of rabbit holes for you to fall down. It is a novel about the forces that shape children into adults. And for Annie, it's her mother, the complex relationship the two have, but also her friends, her teachers, and the island she grows up on, which, by the way, is Antigua. So if we bring this back to friendships that appear romantic, you, the reader, need to decide if that queerness is pushing back on societal norms, a desperate desire for people to like her, a strange replacement for her mother, or something else entirely. And you can do this sort of substitution for multiple things, but there is no one answer to one of these questions. It's a really complex web of influences, and that creates this really weird image of who Annie is. You're not quite sure who Annie is and who Annie is forced to be. While I've mentioned the hints of sapphic relationships in this book, I want to point out that this is not an LGBT book. I've picked on a micro issue and focused on it in this review, just an example of the techniques used. This is definitely a coming of age novel. It is for fans of authors who can produce great characters and great setting. And it is saying a lot about Antigua and the issues it has, or rather had, as this book is now 40 years old. Address Unknown by Catherine Taylor. Published back in 1938, this is the shortest book in this video, and it's really a short story. This was banned in Nazi Germany, and you can very clearly see why. What shocks me is that it was written in 1938 and not 1945, pointing out just how predictable things were. It is an epistolary story. There is a series of letters between two friends, former business partners. One has returned to Germany while the other is an American Jewish art dealer. And it demonstrates the rationale of the German in this friendship and how Hitler convinced an entire country to look the other way. I love the way this book ends. It is so satisfying and so intelligent. I really can't say a lot about this book, but I'm going to make you a promise. It is 64 pages long. It will take you 90 minutes to 2 hours to read. It's in the public domain. You can get a copy for free, and there is absolutely no way anybody watching this video will dislike this story. It's a guaranteed 4 or 5 star book. It is in the bank. Just go and read it. Isaac's Song by Daniel Black. This is a sequel, or more accurately, I would suppose, the companion to Don't Cry For Me. They both stand alone, and they could be read out of order, but you'll get a little bit more if you read both. And frankly speaking, if you liked one, you'd be stupid not to pick up the other one. As love, hate, or otherwise these books, you're going to have very similar opinions on both. In Don't Cry For Me, we heard from a father who was terminally ill and had an adult son who was gay. And as he grew up, the father was horrible to his son for being feminine, always trying to pressure him to be a real man. In that novel, he explains his justification and reasoning for his action and also expresses regret and sorrow for them. Essentially, it's a big apology and a confession that Jacob actually did love Isaac, just badly. Isaac's Song is the same novel from the point of view of Isaac, the son, and his experiences are not the same as his father. For a start, there are countless events in Isaac's life that his dad wasn't present for. There are these long periods of their relationship where they just didn't speak. And just like in Don't Cry For Me, when we learn about Jacob's life before Isaac was born, we learn about Isaac's life apart from Jacob. One of the things that is very different in this book is the discussion around domestic violence. A change of point of view will do that, but this is where I think reading both books adds something to the experience. Black is looking at the impact of domestic violence on Isaac, the child. But if you read Don't Cry For Me, you can see that there is a lot that Isaac is ignorant of. The character creation, the themes, and the prose are all amazing. But personally, I didn't find this as impactful as Don't Cry For Me. There are several shocking events in Isaac's life that I knew were coming. Specifically, I'm thinking about something Isaac's mother does. And when that happens the first time, not only was that a gut punch, you could see how these parents loved their child differently. You could see a lot about who they were as people, and having already made that observation and had that gut punch, I just wasn't shocked. I didn't learn anything from those events. That certainly doesn't make this book bad or anything like that, but it's kind of like a reread when a book has a good plot, and this one does have a pretty good plot. When you reread those books, you're never going to have the same experience when you were reading it the first time. It is still worthwhile. There is still a lot of new things in this book. It is still overall fantastic and just a quality, brilliant read. But I think my preference would have been for these two books to be one chunky book. But you can do a lot worse than a novel with vivid characters, engaging plot, and a complex discussion around themes of queerness, growing up, and domestic violence, all written with nice prose. Overall, this is a great book. Caste by Isabel Wilkinson. Wilkinson is essentially comparing the system of racial oppression in the USA with the caste system in India, and arguing that the US has a caste system too. And I think she's arguing it very, very well. I think it's pretty impossible to deny what she's saying. Wilkinson also brings in examples from Nazi Germany. But rather than demonstrating the similarities between the US and Nazi Germany, she is demonstrating the influence the US system of oppression on the black population had on the Nazi German system of Jewish oppression, and how in some situations the US system was even too cruel for Nazis to implement. I think that this is just such an excellent example. We are all brought up and told that the Holocaust is the worst example of human cruelty, persecution, and so on. And look, it is stupid to say this case of widespread torture and genocide is worse than that one, because there just comes a point when ranking atrocities is meaningless. But Wilkinson isn't ranking, she is comparing, and seeing these two systems side by side, they're a lot more alike than I think any reader would have imagined, and that is truly shocking. One of the more meaningful arguments of this book is where Wilkinson says caste isn't hatred, it's routine. It brings up images of people saying, I'm not racist, I love black people, I have black friends. When we listen to people say that, we sort of dismiss them as liars, but what if they really did believe what they were saying? What if there was a caste and the people saying it just didn't understand the routines, normality, and prejudices that they were creating and just flat out didn't see? A very powerful and well-written book. I think this would have been even more powerful and better had I read it closer to when it was published and the Black Lives Movement was still very current and fresh in my mind. But I just cannot fault Wilkinson's argument and logic and research. The President and the Frog by Caro de Robertis. Caro de Robertis is a fantastic author. I really like everything they write. So I've got some really exciting news I discovered while preparing this review. On the 13th of May, they have a new non-fiction title coming out. So Many Stars, an oral history of trans, non-binary, genderqueer, and two-spirit people of colour. How cool. The President and the Frog is about a retired president of a country which is unnamed but is clearly Uruguay. The president is an old man and he lives a very simple life, turning down the opportunities of wealth to live in a fancy shack on a piece of land. Everything that he needs to be happy is there, and not a lot extra. He was once known as the poorest president in the world, and he is about to be interviewed by a reporter from Sweden. During the interview, we will learn of his legacy, a guerrilla who was jailed for inciting violence, only to become the face of human rights and selflessness of this country. As he talks to the journalist about his life, there is one secret he is unsure if he should reveal: the truth about the frog. Weirdly, this novel is very playful and funny at times, but it is also very philosophical and tackles some really big issues today. That's not an original concept by any means, but what Robertis has done is get the balance spot on. They effortlessly change the reader's emotion from tense to relaxed, both creating the correct mood for humour, hence enhancing the funny, and not having to take anything away from their important messages at the same time. I found this book really hopeful. In my 40 odd years of being alive, I don't think I've witnessed one PM in my country that has put the people first. There have been a combination of bad and worse, and every election produces an even worse choice. This novel shows a different way of being a ruler, and I know it's a work of fiction, but it is actually based on a real-life politician, Jose Murcia, the 40th president of Uruguay, a man who donated 90% of his salary to charities that benefited the poor, leading him to be called the world's humblest head of state. By the way, 10% of his salary, what he would have been left with, is $1,200 a month, which is lower than the cost of living in Uruguay. He just sounds like a good president, and it's nice to hear a story like that in a time like this. Not that he didn't struggle to achieve what he wanted to, not that his story isn't dark. It touches on things like mental illnesses, political prisoners, and torture, but it also provides just that little bit of hope and a good example. Friday Black by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brener. If there's an author out there writing speculative fiction the way Nana Kwame Adjei-Brener does, then I want to read them. This kind of reminds me of Eliza Clark's collection, She's Always Hungry. Fans of one will surely love the other. This collection starts with the story The Frankenstein Five, a story surely inspired by the Central Park Five, in which we look at the justice system and prejudice against the black people and the natural response to that. In each story, a different aspect of racism is highlighted and turned up in a weird and futuristic dystopian or horrific way. A different indifferent short story turns consumerism and the Black Friday sales into a lawless massacre, highlighting the indifference the workers in the system have towards the deaths in front of them. What I love about this metaphor is that surface level it is critical of consumerism. But think about it for a bit more and you could be talking about the ways companies operate, the way they treat their workers, the way they're exploitative of their working conditions, or even their supply chains, the inclusion of slavery and murder in their supply chains, which is much more common than people realize. For example, these are all things that are part of Amazon's supply chains today, and not just Amazon. And it's all made possible by the casual indifference or active aid from those who work there. And what does all that have to do with racism? Well, who do we think works those jobs? Who is seeing those things? Who has been mistreated? Who has been casually indifferent? And if they weren't casually indifferent, if they were concerned, what would the outcome be? Sometimes casual indifference is required in order to survive the churn of the machine. This is exactly what I expected from the author of Chain Gang All-Stars, but it's short stories instead of a novel. Absolutely brilliant. Salt Blood by Francisca de Torres. 1695, and Mary is born as her brother Mark dies. So Mark can continue to receive Mark's inheritance and keep her and her new child fed. Mary must become Mark. Mary leaves home as a teenager to work as Mark in the service of a French mistress, before joining the Navy and developing a love for the sea that lands them smack in the middle of the golden age of pirates. Along the way, their identity will constantly transition between Mary and Mark. This is based on the true story of Mary Read. There is a lot to love about this book. It reads like a fantastic commercial adventure novel. Great plot, great characters, great stories, just a really enjoyable ride. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have depth. I love the playing with gender this novel does. It really creates this lovely intersection between feminist issues and gay issues, and trans issues. That Mary changes into Mark and Mark changes back to Mary whenever it suits really demonstrates the advantages and disadvantages of being a man or a woman has in certain situations around the world. And sure, we're unlikely to hang pirates in these days, although the rate some places in this world are going, it won't be long. The attitudes demonstrated in this book are attitudes we still see today, so that Mark or Mary is dodging them makes complete sense. Mark is attracted to women and later to a man, so he transitions back to Mary. Mary's sexuality is similar to Mark's, but yet it doesn't quite seem to match. All this is saying a lot about the heteronormativity of society. Mark and Mary, after all, are the same person. And one could ask, if you're a man who falls in love with a woman dressed as a man, does that make you gay? Gender and sexuality really shouldn't matter. We're attracted to whoever we're attracted to. But this novel really demonstrates just how silly prejudice by gender and sexuality is, and just how much of a social construct these ideas are and how fuzzy they can be. This is such an intelligent intersectional novel, and yet it's also a fun pirate novel. I love the clarity of prose this is written with. It's really simple, yet there's a lot of subtlety to it as well. A really good time with some really good themes. What else do you need? Happiness Falls by Angie Kim. Adam is the father of a Korean-American family and has gone missing, and things are just not adding up. Told from the point of view of Maya, the 20-year-old daughter of the family, she really has this big dilemma on her hands with her mother and brother she must figure out. Her other brother, Eugene, was the last to see the father alive. The only issue is that he is non-verbal, very autistic and special needs, and the more they investigate, the more it looks like Eugene might have been involved in the disappearance and maybe the death of her father. Does her family do everything they can to find their missing father, or do they try and protect Eugene? What a horrible dilemma. There are two big things that come out of the investigation. First is an ongoing experiment Adam is running with his non-special needs children, an attempt to measure happiness and how it changes when things are presented differently. For example, both children will be taken to an ice cream store separately. One child would be told that they were going to an amazing new ice cream store that had just opened, only to find out that it was closed and they had to go to an alternative. The other was presented with the alternative as a great ice cream shop to try. Which child was happier? Maya's general sarcasm and skepticism was noted as a potential source of errors for these experiments, which she also takes as her dad secretly thinking that she's a bit of an arsehole. The other big discovery was that Eugene may have had a way of communicating with them through some radical new therapy. Either that or their father is cheating on their mother. Comparisons to Eugene and Stephen Hawking are made, except that everybody knew Hawking was a genius when he developed muscular degeneration, while Eugene was born with his issues, leaving everybody to assume that he is stupid. Kim is very much letting us know the value of communication in assessing other people's intelligence, and pointing out how flawed and ableist this is. And I can see that in my own society, not just with disabled people, but even with how people with accents that can be a little bit difficult to understand are treated, or the elderly, or people with stutters and other speech issues, and even just people who are a little bit unsure or not confident about themselves. But of course, this issue is much worse for people with physical disabilities. Kim doubles down on this when Maya starts to question things about Eugene. You realise she doesn't actually know her brother very well at all. As the police begin to close in on Eugene, Maya must figure out if she trusts Eugene or not. The idea of maximising happiness is a very experimentally flawed idea, and I love that Kim doesn't shy away from that, and that Adam acknowledges the flaws in this novel, but continues with his experiment anyway. It becomes a weird meta issue in this book too. Like, why aren't more of us talking about this? If I gave you the choice between being happy for the rest of your life or being rich for the rest of your life, which one would you pick? By the way, there's no suggestion that being rich leads to being happy. Actually, most studies think that once you earn enough to cover your basic needs and just a little bit more, money is not at all linked to happiness. So what do you pick? And how many people do you think would be picking the same choice as you? I mean, I would pick happiness, but only after looking at every loophole I could possibly find to ensure that I could maybe get both. It's a real interesting discussion that comes out of this book. Why don't we prioritize happiness more? Was this book particularly sophisticated? No, but it did poke my brain in new and interesting ways. It explored unique themes, and it has an engaging plot, great characters, and that's what I read for. I don't care if a book is subtle about it. If subtle works, great. But sometimes being slapped over the head works too, and I'm happy with that. Fall on Your Knees by Anne-Marie MacDonald. When Jess placed a backlist novel by the absurdly talented Anne-Marie MacDonald in her best videos of the year, it didn't matter what else made that list. Anne-Marie MacDonald was getting read. She is such an unusual voice for a modern author. I would assume that she was a long forgotten, probably dead author from the early 20th century or maybe even the Victorian era. This was a wild ride of a multi-generational saga that goes to some really dark places. I'm not going to tell you much about the plot. It is fantastic. Go into it knowing as little as you can and enjoy the wild ride. But there are some big trigger warnings in this book, so look them up if you have boundaries, if you have traumas or things you don't want to read about. Please check. What MacDonald does really well in this novel is reveal what happens in the order that makes for the best reading. It does mean that you jump around in timelines a fair bit. Characters who are dead are brought back to life as you jump back in time 30 years to reveal a little extra detail, which allows you to place things in the correct context. It allows you to learn things in the order that makes sense for this novel. This is a plot-first novel, but it really does make a mockery of the idea of a plot or a character-focused novel, because the characters in this novel are absolutely fantastic. My favourite was Frances. I suspect a lot of people will agree with that. She's a rebel, she's super intelligent, she has so much trauma, and she should have trauma, but this trauma I don't think comes from the big things that have gone wrong in her life. And as we see her grow, she takes on responsibilities before she is really ready for them. And that is something that all the women in this family have in common, but it impacts them very differently. And Frances has this reckless nature, doing things that are very unladylike and pretty dangerous when you think about it, really. The impacts of trauma on the individual's family, the next generation in the long terms, is a major theme in this book. While Frances behaves in a very certain way, other characters become reserved or reclusive, and we see how the trauma of one character impacts the life of the next, rendering one of the characters with a permanent physical disability. The family at the centre of this novel is part Scottish, part Lebanese, which leads to an animosity between different branches. This allows for racism to be explored too. However, the cause of this animosity cannot be simplified to just one thing, and if it could, it certainly wouldn't be racism, which kind of gives us an interesting view of how things evolve from one grievance into another. Finally, a big issue in this book is forbidden love, and while I'm generally a believer of the RuPaul school of everybody say love, there were definitely some mucky, horrible things explored in this novel. Maybe sometimes love isn't really love. But what I find most interesting is what kind of love is forbidden and what isn't. When a man is trying to marry a 14-year-old and the issue is that it is an interracial marriage and not paedophilia, it tells us a lot about our past and the world our ancestors lived in. And these kind of examples and how things evolved can be utilized to explain some horrible attitudes that exist today. This is a really chunky novel, and it takes the time to do what it wants to do and entertains you the entire way. Plot, characters and themes are all working together perfectly. Solid writing and vivid setting. I really adore this author. Matrescence, on the metamorphosis of pregnancy, childbirth and motherhood by Lucy Jones. You know it is a fantastic non-fiction book when you stop reading it to message people about the cool fact you've just learned. As a general rule, I don't think non-fiction is a good book club read, but this book is the exception. It's a real conversation starter and just truly interesting. This is a book about motherhood, about getting pregnant, giving birth, and I just never appreciated how interesting all that is. Do you know that women have the DNA of every pregnancy they've ever had floating around inside of them? They're actually chimeras. This is one of the cool things I learnt reading this book. I didn't know how badly researched this area was, and hopefully this book will go some way towards changing that. If for nothing else, then it's really interesting. This is very clearly a big feminist book, but I'm sorry, I just can't stop indulging the science nerd inside me. I'm geeking out at how interesting this is. The topics that made me fall in love with this book was the impact Matrescence has upon a woman's mental health, her personality, mood, and a lot of the very basic things that make up who we are as a person. The amount of sleep a mother gets as she raises her newborn is banned under the Geneva Convention as an act of torture too cruel to use. That's right, all babies are war criminals. And Lucy Jones is asking the question, how much mental illness is inevitable? On the lighter side of this topic, a woman's personality changes when they get pregnant, often becoming calmer. However, that's not always the case. As a conversation starter, I would love to know, women who have more than one child, did you notice your personality changed differently during your pregnancies? And if so, is that somehow reflected in your child's personality? The thing that really challenged me about this book was asking the question, at what point are mother and baby one person? And at what point do they become two? And I've always naturally considered the baby as a separate person inside another person, but I'm quite compelled by the argument that they are the same person until birth now. I'm not saying one thing is right or the other, but for me, logically, I feel like this should be quantized. Either they're one person or they're two, but this becomes really blurry and uncertain. The fact that I started the review with a mother carries around the DNA from all of her previous pregnancies makes that even more blurry. If my mum is, say, 1% me, does that make her 1.01 people? I feel so out of depth and confused here. It is absolutely brilliant. If you hate mothers, don't pick up this book. Everybody else who isn't that specific type of monster I have just mentioned, This is a wonderful, enlightening read that I simply cannot recommend enough. The Unbroken Beauty of Rosalind Bone by Alex McCarthy. I have two bad things to say about this novel. It is the only thing that Alex McCarthy has written, and I wanted to spend more time in this world, and this book is just too short. I will say a lot of positive things about this book, but the thing that will go underappreciated in this novel is just how good the prose is and how good the setting is. Personally, these are the things that I don't normally love as much as plot, characters and themes. But in this book you can see how the prose and the setting enables the plot, the characters and the themes to stand up and stand out. And then mix a teaspoon of Welsh charm with a truckload of Welsh bleakness and some general horrible shit, and you have a novella that is very accurately marketed as to fans of Claire Keegan. Alex McCarthy is the Welsh Claire Keegan. Katrine Bone lives with her mother Mary in the Welsh valleys. Mary used to have a sister, a beautiful sister, but she disappeared a few years before Katrine was born, and nobody knows where. This is presented as the mystery that the novel is built upon, but soon the answer becomes obvious to most readers, and the real question you want answered is not where did she go, but why did she go? And as that slowly unravels, this novel slowly builds from good towards incredible. It's a hard novel to review because it is built on this fear and suspense you have for these vivid, lovely characters. But there's just so much about this novel that will stick with me. There are two brothers, they're quite young, they're boys, from the wrong side of the track, and they're a little bit notorious. One of them goes into a small cafe and the owner asks some questions, and as they get talking, the owner provides the boy with a free cup of tea and a biscuit, and just that little bit of kindness, you can see this kid who is pretending to be a reasonable human being actually becoming a reasonable human being. And it is just so clear that just a little bit of kindness is all he needs to get back on track. He needs somebody to believe that he is an alright human. And then his brother comes into the cafe and makes him leave, and he's all back to being an undesirable. I love how that great little scene in this book says so much. There is character construction there. It is emotional. It's metaphorical. Everything written in this novel is doing multiple things. It is so well crafted. The big themes are trauma, living with trauma, secrets, perceptions, the impact of other people's perceptions on how we view ourselves, and crime that places others in danger's way. This book is just simply superb. If Alex McCarthy is not busy working on her next novel right now, she should be chained to her desk and typewriter, if she still uses a typewriter or it's indeed 1953. We need more from her. This is a sublime novel. And then there were three, and picking between these three books was so hard. One of these books is just consistently an all-round great book. One of these books has the highest highs I've read in a long time, although it is imperfect. And the other one of these books is an emotional dropkick in the heart. And I wouldn't say any of these three books is better than the rest. They're all doing such different things. How could I possibly compare them? Nonetheless, I did write them down in a certain order, so I guess I subconsciously ranked them. Before I reveal the top three, I'd like to take a moment to thank all my wonderful patrons. We meet online twice a month to discuss books. If that's something you would like to do, or you'd like to support this channel, why don't you consider signing up? The link is in the show notes. Now back to the books, and let's reveal the top three. Hot Springs Drive by Lindsay Hunter. This is a messy girl novel meets soap opera, meets murder mystery, meets exploration of trauma. It is getting marketed as a literary thriller, which is correct, but also feels like it's selling this novel short, because there is so much more here. For example, there is a wonderful exploration of an eating disorder. It is really quickly and efficiently set up, but you see what was once a weight loss goal quickly morph into full-blown anorexia. Hunter was able to help us really understand and feel the power this woman gains from not eating. And she does that in just a few sentences. That's really powerful writing. This is a novel about two families who live next to each other. There are crushes between the children. Actually, there's a little bit more between the children than than just crushes, who are teenagers, because that was beginning to sound very wrong. And between the adults, there is also a little bit more than just crushes going on. This allows for this really nuanced and wonderful character construction. What motivates these adults to cheat? It makes perfect sense to me. I mean, it is a little bit just about the sex, but it is so much more than that. Confidence, validity, fantasy. Lindsay Hunter has written these characters with such open emotional vulnerability, and the love triangle between the three teenage children, first love, first emotional connection, the teenage relationship felt so different to the parents, and such a complex mucky set of relationships that I just loved exploring. And then somebody is murdered. And when that happened, my heart sank, because this was the sort of thing that will completely change a novel. And it did, but yet it was still incredible. There was a little bit of whodunit going on, which was interesting enough, but it does more become about the lasting impacts this has on the characters involved, specifically the teenagers who are almost 30 when this novel finishes. And we go from characters thinking, I need some confidence, I need some connection, that's why I'm sleeping around, to I feel numb, I need to normalise being a bit of a slut to come to terms with what happened to my mother. And again, I just got it, the writing was just so good. As an idea for a novel, this is curious, a little bit interesting, but nothing too special. But in its execution, this is exceptional. If it's there to write about, it gets written about. There is such synergy between the characters and the plot. The plot is used to help us understand these characters, which in turn makes us invest in them more and makes us invest more in what happens in the plot. It's a bit of a feedback loop. If there's a central theme to this novel, it has to be love, intimacy, and sex, and how those things can be identical or completely different, and all the different various forms they can take. But honestly, Lindsay Hunter could write about the drying process of paint and it would still be amazing. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this book. Everything is done well, and when I say there were 3 books, this was the one that was all round great. But the book with the highest peaks was The Deluge by Stephen Markley. Reviewing this book makes no sense whatsoever. If I were to look at all the positive things in this book, it is really up there with the best books ever written. But there is also a long list of flaws. And flat out, I don't feel like I should have liked this book. Part of me is really surprised Sean likes it. But everything that is wrong about this book is overshadowed by the sheer brilliance, the likes of which you will remember if you read this. I think I have more complaints about this book than any other book that I've given 5 stars to. But if you think about it for a second, that's also a measure of how good this book is, that doesn't matter. And then I start exploring those complaints and wondering, are they intentional? And the flaws I see start to become thought-provoking, and maybe that even makes this a much better book. I'm confused. This is a speculative climate novel come political satire, or more accurately, political criticism, starting in the mid-2000s and ending in the mid-2040s. Spanning almost 1,000 pages, it is an investment of time that is well worth it. Markley follows a handful of characters, political advisors, activists, and normal humans, as civilization begins to collapse due to the climate emergency. Kate is the character that stands out to me. She is a charismatic mess, both in how she reads and in how she acts. A political activist who is treating climate change as the #1 issue. She forges alliances between anybody who will have her, pushing aside issues that divide in hopes of fostering meaningful climate action. Becoming politically powerful, Kate moves closer and closer to forging a deal between Democrats and Republicans on the climate issue. Kate also courts controversy with her promiscuity, advocating for open relationships, sleeping around, and on one instance blurring the line between acceptable and being a bit of a Lady Bill Clinton. And this is something I think that was done pretty poorly. I understand the feminist argument Kate has for all the different sex partners she has, but she ignores feminist issues all the time. We never really understand why she sleeps around so much, and it really does look like man riding a woman who boobed tittily down the bouncing stairs. But then I wonder if the controversy helps Kate. Does the media's love of writing about her keep her, and by definition her cause, in the spotlight? It does seem very Hollywood actress leads a sex tape and suddenly she's an overnight star. Or could this be meta? Is it intentionally writing about Kate's sex life to point out that women in power have sex thrown at them as a way of discrediting them? He certainly explores that in the novel. Ultimately, I'm not sure if this is a red flag or a masterstroke, but it has sparked thoughts, and does it actually matter if the author intended to be thought-provoking, if they are thought-provoking? I am firmly of the belief that politicians are getting worse. In the country I live, Australia, Bob Hawke was Prime Minister when I was born, and I don't think he was a particularly good Prime Minister. But when I look at what follows, he's very high on my rankings. And we see the presidential candidates in this book just get worse and worse. In the USA right now, we have a very unorthodox president. He got elected without even being on the ticket. I think many of my US viewers would be assuming that this is a bit of a low point and things can really only get better at the next election. But hold on a second, I think Markley shows us just how things can get even worse. Just the sort of positive thinking we need right now. There are inside negotiations between the different political parties. We see climate solutions put forward and ignored, twisted by political forces, starting off as one thing and being compromised into another. We see people being twisted just as much. And you just know that he's done the research. It's so realistic, it must be happening somewhere in the world. If you want to understand why we're not doing anything about climate change, read this book. There is another thing I find about Kate that is very interesting. She is fiercely non-violent in her activism, but certainly not everybody who agrees with her. The obvious comparison I can make is to Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X. Kate doesn't endorse violence and moves to distance herself from it, yet the media will link the violent activists to the non-violent activists. In Australia, I see the term Greenie and the political party the Greens linked in the same way as to discredit them. And the same can be said of alt-right. And Markley is great at demonstrating the media manipulation going on. The violence of Malcolm X allowed Martin Luther King to have more influence in his negotiation. A combination of violent and non-violent action is usually the most effective. The suffragettes and the independence of India are two other examples, although one has a lot more violence than the other. Markley's exploring this from a very weird place. Because yeah, sure, there are guerrilla forces killing people, yet the real violence seems to be with things like bushfires. And will that be enough to allow Kate to make the change she needs? I've talked a bit about violent activism, but we need to acknowledge how the powers that be control people. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X both have conspiracy theories around their death, although I would say that Malcolm X seems much more possible, credible, likely, whatever you want to say. But regardless, one doesn't need to look too hard to find other cases of governments killing people who they disagree with. Russia pretty recently openly killed Yevgeny Prigozhin. Putin doesn't even feel the need to cover up his assassinations at the moment. Control is often violent, but it doesn't have to be violent, and that's also demonstrated in this novel. What Markley has really done, like nobody else, is build a world that is very believable, follows the trends and patterns of our current world, adds in a couple of characters, and predicts where it is going. In doing so, he has demonstrated all the ways people manipulate other people, from advertising to flat out shooting them in the head. The world he has built is something else, and it is like nothing else I've ever read. No book like this exists to my knowledge. This is something very special. Ti Amo by Hannah Oskavik, translated from Norwegian by Karen Fastra. Every now and then, a book just grabs you and literally chokes the life out of you. This was such a hard read. I was literally doing just 5 pages at a time at one point, and I'm going to reveal something really personal in this review, because I don't really feel like I am in a position to say how amazing this book is, or even if it is amazing or not. I just know the impact this book had on me. This is the hardest book that I have ever read. This is autofiction based on the author's own life. A Norwegian woman living in Italy with her Italian husband who is terminally ill. It is essentially about her role as a carer, and it is eerily accurate and such an emotional read. There is one scene in it. Her husband calls out in pain while he's in the bathroom, and she rushes in to check on him, expecting to see he has hurt himself, only to find that he's slipped but otherwise fine, and he has sprayed diarrhea all over the wall. She helps him up, cleans him up, puts him on the couch, cleans up all the poo, and afterwards they have this conversation where he's almost scared and he says, "I thought you would be so angry." And she says, "I was just so worried that you had hurt yourself. For the past 12 months, my wife has gradually been getting sicker and sicker. Due to this illness, she has lost the ability to walk, and I've had to become her carer." And I have had a very, very similar conversation to that was in the book. Fortunately for me, poo wasn't the catalyst for it. But when illness makes somebody incapable of looking after themselves, they feel like a burden, and their natural response is shame and fear of getting in trouble. And as a carer, your natural response is, "I hope you're okay. I hope you have a good day. I hope that you'll get better." I find it so sad that it is so normal to think that your loved one will be angry with you at such a vulnerable time in your life. But tragically, illness often means that people aren't mentally firing on all cylinders, and they don't realize that a carer literally cares for somebody because they care about them, and that a carer doesn't need to forgive them. There's nothing to forgive. It's not an issue. Now, alternatively, insert all the horrible illnesses that debilitate and kill people here, and they can go get fucked. I'm pretty angry at them, but I'm not angry at my wife for being sick. And that's something really well explored in this book. The thing I found basically impossible to read about was the mortality of it all, the inevitable end. When I read this book, I didn't know what was wrong with Nell. Actually, I still don't. But she was in this situation where I was thinking about the possibility of her death and what that might look like and what I might have to do, knowing that it was unlikely, but definitely not off the table. So it felt like I was reading about my future. It was forcing me to come to terms with something I wasn't sure I was ready to do yet, and nor that I needed to do yet. Now, I'm really pleased to say that Nell has been put on some new drugs and is regaining her strength. It will still be about 12 months before she has recovered, and she is a long way from better. She still needs help walking, but we're having conversations about how to help her get better. What is the most efficient way of doing it, rather than what's wrong with her? What can we do? What treatment is there out there? That wasn't true when I was reading this book. So this novel was like everything I was going through, but the worst case. It was like, look what you've got to look forward to. I have no concept of how emotional or upsetting this book would be, or how hard it would be to read for other people. But for me, it really hit on that personal experience that I was in the middle of as I read this. There is no comparison to this book. This is the most emotional book I have ever read. I understood everything that the protagonist did. I didn't need an explanation. I literally just got it instantly. Even the dodgy stuff that I wouldn't do, even the stuff that I'm not doing, I still understood it. I still get it. I know where those emotions come from. I didn't need it explained to me. I didn't have to ponder or work it out. And in the moment of my life that I was reading this book, I felt truly seen by this novel, and it was just a little bit too accurate for comfort. This is a book that does what you expect. It has fantastic character creation, even better relationship generation, and if you have ever had to care somebody, it will hurt you emotionally. Even if you haven't, I would suggest not reading this, say, in public or on your lunch break at work. An absolute miserable snotter of a book. I've tagged all the booktubers I took suggestions from in this video. Please check them out. Watch a video or two from them. They are all quality creators. This is my favorite video to create all year, just because the reading is always excellent. And if you've watched this to the end, I'll let you know that I'm doing a twist on this video soon, and it's a very cool book prize themed twist. So make sure you're subscribed and ring that bell if you haven't already so you don't miss out. And if you've watched to the end, give yourself a gold star. Thank you very much. Bye bye.